Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
For 4 years, Betty had not believed in happiness. Once she had everything a woman could wish for: a loving husband, 3 wonderful children, a beautiful apartment downtown, exotic trips once a year with the whole family to the end of the world, an expensive car. But everything changed dramatically when William died. The man was coming home late at night. A meeting at work had gone long. He never felt sorry for himself, realizing that a large family must be adequately provided for. Work took up a lot of his time. But even in such a busy schedule, he found days that he could devote to Betty and the kids. That unfortunate night, William got behind the wheel of a badly washed-out car. Their company was preparing for an important project, so the man hadn't slept much in the last few days. The road was empty, so at some point William relaxed and apparently lost his guard. He simply did not notice the danger coming at him. At an intersection, a truck slammed into him at full speed. There was no chance of escape. Looking at the traffic camera footage, Betty realized that if William had slowed down for even a fraction of a second before the intersection, the terrible tragedy would have been avoided. Inattention and fatigue were to blame. And of course, the driver of the truck, who presumptuously hoped to speed through the deserted intersection on a red light. There's no way to blame anyone now, because there's no coming back. It took Betty a long time to accept what had happened. When she received a call from the police, the woman was convinced that she had been the victim of a telephone prank or scammers who were pulling money out of gullible relatives, reporting that a family member was in trouble. But something in the caller's tone made her wary. Senior Lieutenant Jacob, as the man introduced himself, was waiting for her at the neighborhood morgue. Betty got there in 10 minutes. She almost had an accident on the way. She entered the building on wobbly legs. Yeah, this is crazy. The woman convinced herself. There must be some mistake. It's not the first time Vidya's been late for work. And the fact that the phone was silent was just to avoid distractions. Betty was called by a man's voice, and when she turned around, she saw a young boy in front of her. And if he had not unfolded in front of her crusts, informing about his belonging to the law enforcement agencies, she would not have believed that she was an officer. Betty, the senior lieutenant continued, "My name is Jacob. We spoke on the phone." "Yes," Betty replied uncertainly. "Where is he?" "Jacob, I can see him." "That's probably not the best idea." "Betty," I answered the young man in an embarrassed sort of way. "You know, it was a terrible accident. There's hardly anything left of the car. And your husband, I've called you now, rather for identification of personal belongings. I don't think it's wise to make a body identification in your condition." Everything inside plowed on and shrank. Betty didn't understand how anyone could speak so callously about her husband. She still hadn't given up hope that someone else had died. There weren't many others in their huge town of William. But right now, she was the one who was forcing Betty not to go into a frenzy. The policeman led the woman into a small room. Another young man sat at a desk, concentrating on typing something into his phone. Kevin turned to him. "Jacob, get the bag." Kevin lazily pulled out a desk drawer and took out a clear plastic bag containing some red-stained objects. "Here, Betty, take a look," began to lay the contents out on the table. "Jacob, do you recognize any of these items?" She was about to declare, without looking, that this was the first time she'd seen it all. But then a gold pendant that she had given to her husband on their wedding anniversary caught her eye. The woman reached for the shiny rectangle, but then her legs gave out. Jacob managed to prop up a chair for her. Everything in front of Betty's eyes swam. She drank the water the policeman offered her. "Yes, these are my husband's things," the woman said in a trembling voice. "We need to go to the station now, fill out paperwork, and watch the surveillance tapes." Jacob addressed her. Betty didn't care anymore. Her whole world had collapsed overnight. What did she care about the paperwork? She fell into a kind of half-forgetfulness and reacted to the words of the staff, clutching William's pendant tightly in her hand. All she cared about now was how to tell her children that their daddy was gone. After the funeral, Betty had completely stopped caring about what was going on around her. The children were looked after by a nanny, and Betty herself began to drink in secret. The housekeeper's critical comments were constantly shoveling bottles out of the trash can. The woman did not react in any way. She locked herself in her room and spent long hours looking at pictures of their once happy family. This went on for several months. Waking up on a frosty winter morning with a severe headache, Betty felt as if she had woken up. Looking at the mess around her, the woman cried. Only now did she finally realize that William would never come into their bedroom again, never hug her or call her. There is the omelet he always made on weekends for breakfast for the whole family. Leaving the room, the woman made her way to the kitchen first thing. Everyone in the house was still asleep. The clock showed only the beginning of 7. Betty was determined to cook her husband's specialty. Her weakened body did not obey her. It was only on the 3rd attempt that she managed to knead the dough. When the last of the scrambled eggs had migrated from the skillet to the plate, Kate came into the kitchen. Her eldest daughter was 8, but she was remarkably advanced for her age. "Mommy," the girl was surprised. "Are you up already?" Kate tried to smile at the woman and hugged her daughter tightly. "I didn't feel well, but I'm fine now." "Did you make Daddy's omelet?" Kate was surprised. Of all the children, she was the only one to realize that her father was gone. Herb, who was only 5. He cried for a long time, but he couldn't quite understand what was happening. Lissa was just a baby, unable to comprehend such information. "Mommy, everything will be like it was before." "Honey," Betty sighed heavily. "It's not going to be the same. But we're strong, really. We'll try to get through this somehow." Kate sat with a confused look, looking at her mother. The girl could hardly believe her words. The woman had lost a lot of weight. Her always neat, stylish hair had turned into a crow's nest. Under the eyes darkened and horrible circles. Her hands were treacherously shaking. "You know what Betty suddenly suggested? Why don't we have a beauty day this morning? Just the 2 of us." They used to do this kind of thing on a regular basis. The first Kate had everything a little girl could want in a family. Therefore, hearing the mother's proposal, the daughter did not hesitate to agree. While they were talking, Herb and Lisette entered the kitchen accompanied by Wendy, the invariable nanny of the Johnson family. Her brother carefully held the little girl's hand, seeing her as a princess. "Mommy." With glee, the little ones cried out, hugging her. They were used to seeing their mother in the kitchen in the mornings. Betty left the room, rarely trying to keep the children from noticing her condition. My good one smiled at Betty, hugging the little one. "Good morning, Wendy." "Good morning. I see you're in a good mood today." Carefully, Betty answered her. There was relief in the woman's eyes. She had been worried about Betty lately. She had been working for the family for 8 years now. In that time, getting used to everyone as if they were family. With William's death, everything had changed. But watching Betty fade away was unbearable. Wendy willingly moved in to help out and take over some of the household duties. Aunt Wendy went to nanny Kate, and today my mom and I are having a beauty day. What you say, my good girl, it's about time. It's better than being cooped up in 4 walls. The day after tomorrow, Betty and Kate set off on their beauty expedition. What did they call a visit to the salon together? Betty was quickly tidied up, and Kate was given a charming braid. However, there was a hitch at the reception. The receptionist said, smiling guiltily, that the payment had not gone through. "Let's do it again." When the payment didn't go through a few more times, she wasn't seriously worried. Taking cash out of her purse, the woman paid by getting into her car. She called the bank and reported her problem. Betty was politely answered by an employee. "You see, the account to which your card is linked is frozen. I can't give you the details over the phone. Come to the office." Betty and William had a joint account. The woman never gave much thought to how much money was in there, and knowing that her husband made very good money. The message about the freeze confused her. Surely it was some sort of technical glitch. The woman convinced herself, "Now I'm going to the bank and I'll find out." But the bank didn't say anything comforting. On the contrary, the situation seemed much worse. The account had been seized and blocked. William was in some kind of debt that Betty had no idea about. They'd never kept secrets from each other. Even if you inherit now, you can't unfreeze the account. The manager broadcast monotonously. By law, debts are inherited too. So here you can either sue, trying to get your money back, or accept it. Neither option suited Betty. Suddenly fear came to her throat. What is this? The woman thought with horror. There's no money. What are we going to do now? Betty did not work anywhere, having successfully married a wealthy and promising man. The foreign language student initially worked part-time as a translator, dreaming of a career as an international translator. But her husband was adamant. I am able to provide for you so that you would not deny yourself anything for the rest of your days at work. Betty never did. And then Kate came along and the woman devoted herself entirely to her family. Betty grinned. For the rest of her life, if only someone had known how things would turn out. Right now, the woman was worried about the children. Of course, there was some cash at home, and the jewelry could be sold for the first time enough. Money was running out at supersonic speed, accustomed to living large. Betty didn't really know where the money was going. At some point, she suddenly realized that the money had run out completely. The jewelry had been sold, the contents of her husband's safe were rapidly melting away. There was nothing to do, so she, overstepping herself, went to Vera Eduardovna for advice. Wendy ingratiatingly began the woman, noiselessly entering the kitchen, where the nanny was cooking something. Oh my goodness, Betty, what are you so frightening? The lady standing at the stove literally jumped up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Betty tried to justify herself. I've got something to talk to you about. Nani replied, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Betty didn't know where to start, but there was no one closer to Wendy right now. She was the only person Betty could talk to normally. Wendy. She started, I don't have any more money. What are you talking about, Betty? And the woman looked at her understandingly. What do you mean, you don't? It always seemed to me that William earned enough to give your grandchildren a good old age. He did, Betty sighed. But he was in some kind of debt, some kind of cosmic debt. I've been to the bank and all the accounts have been blocked. I've been spending 2 months on personal jewelry from the safe, almost sold it all. Betty, are you serious right now? As if she couldn't believe it, Wendy exclaimed. Why didn't you tell me before? It's not a minor problem. You have children. It was embarrassing. Betty excused herself. I've never been very good at counting money. It was William's responsibility. He never let me in on things. Turns out money does run out, so what do we do now? I don't know. We have to get a job before it's too late. The nanny was determined to get a job. Yeah, I've never worked. You did. You know, I got married right after college, and Vidya wouldn't let me earn money on my own. Well, you have a good specialty. Translators are always needed. Wendy didn't give up. Do, where I'll be hired. I graduated from the institute 10 years ago, inexperienced. Nothing to be afraid of, the nanny went on. Work on the internet. I think translations are always in demand anyway. You can't know without trying. And that's true, sighed Betty. Do you think the pay is okay? Well, normal, not normal. It's enough to live on, of course. You have to tighten your belt. But it all depends on you. You know I won't leave you in the lurch, but it's time you got things under control. Hello, David. Betty was visibly nervous as she dialed the number of her husband's friend and companion. This is Betty Johnson. Betty, hi. Where have you been? The man was very surprised. I've been calling. You didn't pick up. I haven't seen you since the funeral. But you know, I was in such a state. I didn't want to see anyone. It's hard, Betty sighed. David, I need to talk to you. It's a serious problem. I think you might be able to help me. No problem. Mitriev's friend inspired confidence. Let me come over. I've got some free time right now. Half an hour later, David was at the apartment. He hadn't been to visit his friends in 6 months. Without William, the place seemed a bit alien. The men had been friends since high school and had been through a lot. They opened their own business and shared both profits and losses. After the wedding, William was a little distant, but David did not take offense, understood everything. He had no family of his own. Personal life was replaced by his favorite work. Joint business did not connect them for a long time. He made a fortune. William went on a solo voyage, engaged in real estate. David was still a small businessman, but he did what he loved. It didn't affect their friendship. So what's your story? The man asked. David began. Betty, tell me, did you know anything about William's affairs? What do you mean? You see, I was at the lawyer's office yesterday, about to file for probate. It's been 6 months. I've got to make it official. Betty suddenly stammered, and David didn't quite understand what she was getting at, and that there were so many millions that you didn't know where to put them. So I went to an old friend for help. No, the tone in which Betty said it alarmed David. You see, William had huge debts. I mean, he never said anything to me about it, so I thought maybe you knew something. They showed me some paperwork, some loans, some private loans, some receipts. And now I have to pay it all back, you know. Which you were genuinely surprised about. What debts? I always thought you were doing great. I was jealous, in fact. How much is it? Astronomical. I don't understand it myself. I thought he was making good money. I talked to Ethan. You know, his assistant. Anyway, he told me that Vidya's been really looking to expand lately. Apparently, he's got the money to do it. I just can't understand why he didn't do it on behalf of the company. I understand, concerned David said. And there's a lot to pay out, sighed Betty. They've blocked all the accounts, but it's still not enough. I think I'll have to sell the apartment. Even so, David was sincerely surprised. The sum seemed to be really impressive. In his estimation, the Johnson apartment was worth a lot. The center of the prestigious building, the huge square footage, the designer finishes. Betty had told him how much he needed to pay off his debts. David even whistled a prize in surprise. Say, will you help me with the deal? Betty asked. You know, I don't know anything about this sort of thing. I'm afraid of getting scammed and losing the price. No problem. Betty, he told me persuasively. You tell me, where are you going to live? Maybe we can find a cheaper place to live. I understand that you're used to luxury, but now you don't have much choice. As they say, it's not a matter of living large. Of course, David is used to luxury. Betty hastened to convince him. It would be nice to have enough for a 2-bedroom in the suburbs. There's still 4 of us, but we can't afford a decent one. Understood. I'll try to find options. David nodded. All right, let's do this so it doesn't take too long. I'll get started right away. Let me take a picture of the apartment. I have a good realtor among my friends. He won't let me down. Mommy will do it, Herb said. Where's my room? Is this where you and Kate will be staying? Betty opened the door to the tiny bedroom. We'll put the beds here and the desk and closet there. No, the boy said crankily. I don't want to go with Kate, she's mean and greedy. I want my room back. Honey, we're gonna live here now. Don't you love it? Look how green the yard is. You'll even have your own tree. By own tree, Betty meant a huge cherry tree with branches that literally burst through the window of the future nursery. And Lisa? Herb persisted. Lisa will live with me. There's plenty of room for us. Trying to smile, Betty answered her son. Kate entered the room. The girl's face showed that she was not happy about her new home either. Mommy started her off. Say, we're poor now. What are you talking about? Betty tried to justify herself, although she knew perfectly well that it was useless to deceive her daughter. How could you? Kate looked at him seriously. The whole place is smaller than our kitchen. It took us an hour to get here. Why are we moving? Mommy, I'm not stupid. Just tell it like it is. Betty took her daughter aside. I didn't want Herb to catch phrases, throw a tantrum. Daughter, she began. I don't want to lie to you. You're right. We don't have any more money. That's just the way it is. But now we have to learn to live again. I had to sell the apartment. A lot of things are going to change. But the important thing is to stay together. Isn't it? Betty looked hopefully at her daughter. The girl's mind was going through an intense process. She seemed to be relating what she had heard to everything that had happened lately. At one point her eyes lit up. And Wendy, what do you mean? She's not coming back. Kate asked disappointedly, since we don't have any more money. And we won't be able to pay it. Kate hurried to reassure her daughter. Betty, Wendy's not going anywhere. We're like family to her. We'll just see her a little less often because she'll have to work somewhere else. But she'll be happy to come to us on weekends. Wouldn't she? Who's going to take care of Lisa and her while they're at school? Well, I'm working from home for now, and then I think daycare will pick up. With sincere faith in her voice, answered the mother. Are you ready to move to a new school? Mommy, I understand everything. I'm not a little girl, Kate said in a serious tone. What difference does it make where I go to school? I can think for myself. Sometimes Betty was amazed at how mature her daughter thought. They couldn't afford the old grammar school. Thank God, they managed to get the child into a neighborhood school, which was indeed considered quite good. But still, it is a stress for the child, accustomed to classmates and individual approach of teachers. And with a kindergarten for younger children, something had to be solved. It turned out that it was not enough just to take and bring the children. The queue was huge, and Betty could not afford private institutions. The cost of attending such seemed exorbitant. And then there were 2 children. Wendy's services, of course, also had to be refused. The kind woman agreed to help with the housework, but Betty felt she had no right to exploit her all the time. She managed to find some work, but translations from French were of little interest now. Everywhere there was a need for specialists in Asian languages, of which the former student of a foreign language had only a vague idea. Everything that she had managed to earn disappeared instantly. The money left after paying off all William's debts was barely enough for a small apartment in a residential neighborhood and a small reserve, which Betty put aside for the very last resort. There was still the car. But a woman with 3 children didn't want to deprive herself of mobility. Although the maintenance of a premium brand iron horse also cost a tidy sum, her attempts to get an official job as an interpreter in an international company failed. Seeing a spectacular, well-dressed applicant, managers eagerly escorted her to their offices. But her lack of experience and 3 children immediately turned them against her. After a few such interviews, Betty gave up trying. Such conversations hurt her ego. And so he stayed in his opinion. Forced to moonlight with occasional translations of contemporary French authors. The editor was in no hurry to pile orders, so the cash flow in the Johnson family did not turn into a stormy avalanche. 6 months after the move, Betty realized that the money is not enough categorically. Ian still had to sell the car, exchanging it for a simpler car. The school Kate went to, although it wasn't elite, still required a lot of money. They were constantly collecting money for repairs, gifts for teachers, and other things. The last thing Betty wanted was for her classmates and teachers to be prejudiced against Katusha because of her family's difficult financial situation, so she paid all the exorbitant fees. That's the way it is in all schools. That's what Alechka said once. The old friend remained one of the few people Betty kept in touch with after her husband's death. The rest of her friends evaporated. As soon as they felt that relations with Ivanov would not bring them any benefits, and the widow might ask to share her blood money as a loan. No one was in any hurry. Betty was a proud person, but few people cared about that aspect. So here she is with her college girlfriend Kelly. David, yeah, Wendy. They supported the single mom as best they could. But in today's world, it's hard to stay afloat without a solid financial backing. You know, Betty kept Kelly going. I've got a friend who's starting a private daycare center with some experimental parenting techniques. Not a lot of clients yet, so the prices aren't too steep. Maybe you could put in a good word with her about your kids. She is a person who understands, responsive, and in trouble will not abandon. I think we can negotiate a discount. You still have to look for a job, for whatever reason. And as long as the kids are at home, that's out of the question. That's true, Betty thought. But I doubt I'll be able to afford even a small sum. You leave that to me, please. I'll arrange everything in the best way, do with the work. Unfortunately, I can't help you. You know that. I'm not doing so well myself. Just as Kelly had said, the owner of the daycare center was able to come to an agreeable arrangement. Betty was relieved to entrust the children to this woman, who, as it turned out, lived nearby and even offered to bring them home. Betty immediately started looking for a job, hoping for some prestigious high-paying place. She didn't. At first, Betty got a job as an administrator in a beauty salon, but she couldn't work there for a month. The relationship with the owner did not work out, who for some reason immediately disliked the newcomer. Betty had no working specialty, although there were a lot of similar vacancies and the salary was promised to be good. There were still options to consider, which the woman was prevented by her pride. But can a person with a higher education go as a cashier or packing food in a supermarket? Betty tried the delivery business so popular with the younger generation. But after a few orders brought to her old acquaintance, she gave up the idea. And it was costing a lot of money in gasoline. Betty, let's go to my place office manager once offered her David, who popped out for tea. We've got a girl going on maternity leave. Wouldn't want to bring in an outsider. It's not a dusty job. Salary, of course, I cannot offer you a huge salary, but a full social package weekends, like normal people free meals. Sure, I'll go. Without even thinking about it, Betty agreed. That's how she got to David's firm. Things were not going well in his place. The woman coped with her duties in full, but relations with coworkers did not go well from the first day. All the women working for David were convinced that Betty got the position because of the chief's favor. Some ladies were openly jealous of her bright appearance and hurried to invent another unflattering gossip about her personal life. But Betty paid no attention. All she was interested in was feeding herself and her children. Besides, her job left her enough time to do translations. True, the woman had no weekends at all. Even a joint walk with the baby she could only dream of. Thank God, Wendy came to the rescue. Making ends meet. Betty had learned to live without her husband. "Mommy," Kate said from the doorstep when she saw Betty staring at her laptop. "I certainly don't think you've forgotten, but I'll remind you. Herb is turning 9 this Sunday, and we haven't even bought a present yet." It's like Kate woke up Betty. "Are you serious about Sunday already? What's the date today?" "Oh, Mom, you're kidding." Amazed daughter. Greetings to distant space travelers from Earthlings. On our planet today is Tuesday, September 4, time 6:37 p.m. I'm totally confused. It's been a madhouse at work today, and I've got a translation due. I couldn't get my hands on it. Betty was exhausted. In the 4 years she'd spent as a widow, a lot had changed in her life. She still worked for David. She was no longer the office manager, but his personal assistant. Her salary was rising with inflation. Betty never learned how to deal with the problem of being broke. Kate became a teenager with growing needs. Herb had already started 3rd grade, and Lissa would be starting school next year. Betty worked hard to give her children everything they needed, but quality clothes and newfangled gadgets were expensive. And the woman didn't want her favorite offspring to stand out from their peers. Of course, Kate constantly argued with her in the store, choosing things simpler and cheaper. But Betty couldn't be persuaded. "Let me finish early tomorrow," her mother continued. "You and I will go shopping and pick out something interesting." "Do you know what he'd like?" "Oh, Mom." Kate squinted. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You've forgotten all about us. You don't even know what your son is interested in." "I'm just kidding. I understand perfectly well. I know everything. I'll show you when we get there. We'll have to stop by the store then." "All right, daughter, whatever you say," the mother gave in. "There should be enough money. I hope I've been saving." The daughter vanished out the door, leaving Betty alone with her thoughts. September 4. The woman thought. After all, the day after tomorrow will be 4 years. As you can see, she didn't. We should at least go to the cemetery. Betty went to her husband's grave once a year. She couldn't take it anymore. You see, his smiling face engraved on the black granite slab. She couldn't. Immediately a heavy wave upon which memories of the past, which were immediately shattered by the equally hard granite of the present. She never took the children with her. Only once had Kate traveled with her, but seeing her daughter's tears was even more unbearable than her husband's stony smile. Leaving work early, Betty took her usual route. David, recognizing where his buddy was going, offered a ride. But it was important for Betty to make the trip alone. There was no traffic, so Betty got to the cemetery quickly. On the way, she stopped by a florist and bought 4 snow-white flasks tied with black power ribbon. The saleswoman smiled sympathetically at her, adding even more tragedy to the situation near the cemetery pine needles. Betty did not observe the typical pattern of peddlers coaxing them to buy paper flowers from them. The beggars and cripples, usually sitting along the walkways on a weekday, were sparsely crowded here. Only the sounds from the granite workshop and the few people gathered around the local pig reminded that this place was still somehow connected to the world of the living. Betty walked with an uncertain gait, noting along the way the landmarks she remembered from past visits: the lush fence, the graves of some authority figure from the 90s. A sad little angel mourns a girl who left the world at the age of 5. A garbage can topped with a pile of colored funeral wreaths. Seeing a double birch tree, a woman turned onto the path on the right. Well, here's a little more. And I'm on the spot, thought Betty, utopia heels in soft ground. The birch trees were already beginning to turn yellow. Ahead I could see a slab of granite gleaming in the sun and revealing some sort of somber golden glow. On the table sat 2 huge crows with gusto, passing something left over from an offering to the dead. Plastic bottles, pale heads, dried branches of never-stirring colors were lying everywhere. Doesn't anyone really clean up around here? Thought Betty. Is it hard to take the trash with you? Here I am, she said in a shaky voice, squatting down in front of the ever-smiling William. I'm sorry I'm alone and haven't been here in a while. I brought flowers. I know you weren't particularly fond of them, but still, it's tradition. With those words, Betty placed the rocks in a jar of water, setting aside the frozen remnants of the ones from last time. And the kids were all grown up now. Kate is such a real bride. You wouldn't even recognize her. They look just like you. Look at this. With these words, the woman took out her phone and started scrolling through the pictures of the children. And Herb is now 9. Yesterday, we went with the kitten to choose a present for him. You would have thought that your son is into web modeling. We bought him an airplane like this. Katya said he'll jump to the ceiling when he sees it. It's a year away from school. She's smart. She's already reading and writing. Sometimes I even do French with her. Betty sighed heavily, brushed away her tears in the palm of her hand. She didn't know what else to say to a dead person. All this superstition never appealed to her. Even as a child, going with relatives to the cemetery, she didn't understand these meaningless conversations with the earth, pouring vodka on the grave, greetings, and farewells. Well, the man had gone. He was gone. What could be done about it? What does he care now about the hybrid cases left to live? What business do I have against myself? Answered Betty to his own question, ostensibly asked by silent interlocutors. It's the same old thing. I work at David's. I don't know where we'd be now if it weren't for him. I don't make a lot of money, of course, but it's enough to live on. Wendy supports us a lot. She's retired and often takes the younger ones to her dacha. All summer long, she took them to the vegetable garden. She never left the berry patch, and Herb has learned to swim. I'm thinking of enrolling him in the pool. The kid needs exercise anyway. For about 15 minutes, Betty sat in complete silence, immersed in the memories of birdsong, immersing her in some marvelous state. Suddenly, this calm was broken by a crackling noise. Betty shuddered fearfully and looked around. Not far from her stood an old man hesitatingly looking at her. I'm sorry I startled you. The elderly man addressed Betty in a peaceful tone. You see, it's Thursday. There's no one here, and I'm lost again. How lucky am I to have met you? No, not at all, the woman replied. You didn't scare me at all. I was thinking, I didn't expect anyone else to be here. Can I help you? If you don't mind, could you help me find my wife's grave? It's been so many years, and I keep getting lost in these gravestones. As if she didn't want me to see her like this, the old man smiled embarrassedly. Yes, of course, she agreed, or rather rose from the ground. Well, I mean goodbye. I'll go, I promise not to be discouraged. I'll give the kids a hug. Betty went to the old man to grow a floor and a cloak. She noticed he was holding a tiny bouquet. That's a must, she thought. I wonder where he found those flowers. They don't look artificial. My name is Michael, the older man introduced himself. And I'm Betty. Nice to meet you, Betty. It's a pity that our acquaintance happened in such a peculiar atmosphere, as if the old man apologized. I see you're interested in my flowers. I'll be honest, I didn't even think it was possible to find Slavs in our city at this time of year. Even abroad, it's off-season. Are you interested? I am. Michael smiled. When my late husband and I traveled to Provence, we visited the quantum fields. The tour guide told us that these flowers are rarely found outside the country. They don't take root anywhere. It's not the right climate or something else. So I was surprised. This is homegrown lavender. I grow them in my own greenhouse. Well, greenhouse is a bit of a mouthful, but lavender? Helen, my wife, was very fond of these flowers. I didn't share that sentiment, but I can't come here empty-handed. I'd like to make her happy. Oh yes, the old man's worried. Let's try to find the tombstone. I used to turn around at that stone bollard, but it's changed in a year. It's weird. I can't find it. It's a white marble monument, not very tall. And there's a bench next to it. Betty looked around. She never really cared much about who was buried next to her husband. A couple rows away. To the right, she noticed several monuments similar in description and immediately headed toward them. On her third try, she found the right grave. Michael called out, "I think I found it. Come here." The old man walked slowly between the rows of graves, trying not to stumble on the grass and slippery paths from the recent rain. "Hello, Helen." He spoke cheerfully, kneeling down on his knees right on the ground. "Again, you didn't want me to come. And in vain, as you always think to yourself, you know what I'll find anyway." Betty looked at the photograph on the monument, an old but surprisingly beautiful woman. There was something subtly oriental in her appearance, and her eyes seemed to be laughing, filled with childish joy. Judging by the date on the plaque, the woman died 10 years ago and also on September 6, as you can see. What a coincidence, Betty thought. I wonder if she wasn't too old yet. Sore, I guess. Suddenly, the old man's voice broke the silence and interrupted her thoughts. He spoke in French. The last thing Betty expected to hear now was French poetry. Not just any poetry, but an excerpt from a famous poem by Arthur Rimbaud, to whom she had dedicated her thesis. In the rolling tides of winter, too, I ran, ogled as the mind of children and peninsulas, breaking away from the land, had not known the triumph of such wild passions. By itself succeeded Betty in translating the stanza uttered by Michael. The old man froze, slowly turned his head in her direction, and looked in surprise at the woman for whom it was worth nothing not only to recognize the rare poem, but also to reproduce it in American. Well, well, I see you like Arthur Rimbaud, the old man inquired. You see, embarrassed Betty takes a seat on the bench. I studied French as a student, and this Rimbaud poem was the subject of my thesis. I was literally mesmerized by this boy poet, because he had no other works. And this poem left a significant imprint on French poetry and literature in general. To say that I was surprised to hear it here now, and in excellent French, is not to say anything. Yes, laughed Michael. There are coincidences in life. How can you not believe that everything in the world happens for a reason? Betty, it's a poem. Helen was obsessed with it. My wife had an excellent command of French. As a young woman, she was into translating the classics. Then one day she came across Arthur Rimbaud. And you know, it was not easy to get such a little-known author, even for students of a foreign language. She read the translation, but it seemed to her that it did not convey the essence of the original. And Helen was a very persistent and determined girl. So she decided to create her own version of the translation. I have an old notebook at home, in which my wife wrote down her versions, but never managed to perfect them, as she thought. It would be very interesting to take a look. I touched on translation topics during my defense, but they were about popular versions. I'm asking purely from a professional point of view, Betty hastened to assure me. No, you're not. If you are really interested, then I invite you to visit. I live alone. My son got married a long time ago and moved to Europe. He visits me once every couple of years. I'm afraid to fly. I've never even seen my grandchildren in person. I can't go to the column. I live as a recluse. My friends, too, all left this world long ago. If it's not too much trouble, come by. I live near the Central Library. You know, the one with the columns and the punishers? I know, Betty smiled. To some, the old man's offer might have seemed dubious. But the woman sensed that the man was very lonely, and the sincerity with which he recounted the details of his life was appealing. Besides, Betty really wanted to look at the translations. Rimbaud was a professional interest. I'll be there. Let's do it tomorrow. 5 o'clock would be convenient. I'll have a couple of hours to spare. Of course, assured her old man. Come, I'll treat you with specialty coffee on Algerian recipe. I'll leave you my phone number. If anything changes, let me know. The new acquaintances stayed at the cemetery for some time, after which Betty kindly offered to give Michael a ride home. All the way home, he told her about the peculiarities of growing flowers in a home greenhouse. Betty had never realized it could be so interesting. She returned home in high spirits. Kate had already returned from school for a quick snack. Mother and daughter drove to daycare. Lissa managed to get into a fight with a boy who was pulling her braids. The conflict ended in a torn shirt. The child's angry mother demanded compensation for the spoiled item. Not wanting to hear an explanation, Betty silently pulled out the money. Noticing that the purse remained almost empty, Ush muttered to herself. It was still a couple days until payday. She didn't scold Lisa, noting only that a real lady wouldn't defend her honor with her fists, would try to take revenge using her intelligence. It's like Mommy, the girl didn't understand. You and I will definitely talk about it, but a little later. But I'm still glad you kept your cool. Mom intervened in Kate's conversation. Why did you give that bitch the money? It's clearly her kid's fault. If you'd stayed out of it, you'd have stayed in one piece. Kate, sometimes you have to give in, the mother replied. I realize that what would the conflict have led to now? We'd have a fight with her. She still won't admit that her little boy is at fault. After all, then I will question her love and methods of upbringing. And an insulted fool can't prove anything. In the end, tomorrow he would attack again, only already with a pitch to the mom. And so we'll teach our princess now. How can you get back at an offender without using your fists? You don't bother them anymore. What about that bitch you called her? Doesn't have the brains to realize her son was insulted. But she did. Kate laughed. She's a sly one. After finishing work, Betty remembered that she'd promised to stop by Michael's. She called her eldest daughter and arranged for her to pick up Lisa from daycare. She warned her that she would be a little late. Mom reached into the phone Kate hung on. Do you have a lot of work to do, or are you going on a date? What date? Oh, baby. Betty laughed. I have an appointment. I'll try not to be long, okay? It's a deal, Mommy whispered to Kate. Don't worry. Betty bought some brownies on the way out because it was awkward to go to a visit empty-handed. She knew a good candy store that sold inexpensive but delicious sweets. She liked to take her children there when she had time for a day off together. The woman parked by the imposing front stucco framing. Noted that the house where the old man lived, even by modern standards, is not simple. In the old days, representatives of the nomenclatura, diplomats, academicians, high-ranking officials lived in such houses. And today, only very wealthy people could afford an apartment in such an architectural object. Michael lived on the 7th top floor. Going upstairs in the elevator with a cast-iron door grate, Betty noticed the rich decoration of the stairwell. The walls were decorated with stucco, the marble floors sparkled with cleanliness, and each door had a gilded plaque with the initials of the owners. She rang the bell at the door and was told that Ferguson lived behind it. The woman waited quite a while before she was opened. Michael greeted her with a broad smile. The old man was dressed in an immaculately tailored gray wool suit that made him seem considerably younger. Good evening, dear Betty. The man greeted her. I didn't expect you to come. Why not? The woman was embarrassed. Well, you have to admit, meeting in a cemetery is a very dubious way to start a relationship. The older man smiled. Although, considering how life flows now, it's amazing that strangers can even talk to each other and find a common theme. I confess, Betty replied. I'm driven by professional interest. And I'd also like to try your advertised coffee, and I brought some cakes. Thank you. Michael took the bundle of treats that was handed to him. Please, come in. Betty walked into the huge living room. The apartment had high ceilings of at least 4 meters. One wall of the spacious room was completely filled with shelves of books. On the shelves were whole collections of rare editions, which the owner of the library had collected for 10 years. There were even some ancient-looking medieval manuscripts and the edition of the Sisters of the 60th Time, captured by the letters on the covers. Apparently, the owner of the apartment was an extremely well-read man, so you could tell by the order that reigned on the bookshelves that their contents were not just decoration or an attempt to impress. "I see you like my little collection," Michael inquired, bringing coffee and sweets into the room under his nose. "Wow, small," replied Betty, continuing to look at the books. "There are at least 2,000 volumes, 3047 to be exact," the old man informed. "There were more. But after Helen died, I donated some of it to the university library, as she had willed. And I'm retired now, but I can't afford to read like I used to. My eyesight's not what it used to be. And you know, Salty was somehow more interesting to discuss what I read than to be alone with my opinion like that. Sometimes I open her favorite illustrated editions and just admire the drawings. Here, for example, Michael reached for one of the shelves, on which stood a whole collection in brightly colored covers, decorated with golden Arabic ornaments. Fairy Tales 1000 and a whole hour showcased an old man's amazingly beautiful full-size book, covered in silk with a glossy field pastadown, and Scheherazade in a flowering garden. This is the 1913 edition in French with illustrations. My, what a beauty! Betty marveled. I would never have guessed that such pieces were in private collections. They are works of art. You're right, smiled the old man. Such collections can easily be sold at auctions for decent money. Today, there are no more than 5 complete collections left, specifically such books. But I will not sell my fairy tales for any money. You see, they're not just well-preserved volumes. They're memories. Moments of happiness forever gone just like that, and forever left in my soul. It's a collection. Helen and I bought it in Paris, would you believe it? At a flea market. And for only 300 francs, although it seemed like a fabulous sum to us at the time. Of course it did. When Soviet citizens got to foreign countries, they bought everything that differed from their usual life. But for some reason, Helen and I didn't go to fashion stores and perfume stores, but went straight to hunting for antiques. The seller asked for 400 for the books, but we had only 300 francs left. Seeing the fire in my wife's eyes, the salesman couldn't stand it and gave in. He must have regretted it 1,000 times over. After all, today the cost of such a collection is at least 30,000 euros. What are you marveling at, Betty? Is it really true? Sighed the old man. So what's the use of money if you can't buy anything with it? Think about it. Where can I go, old man? Such a sum won't bring any joy. Put it in the bank. What's it for a funeral? Maybe, because it's expensive to send him to the grave for that kind of money. I'm not some pharaoh. Betty laughed. Michael was right. She wondered what she would have done if she'd owned such expensive books. She probably wouldn't have hesitated to sell them. He was the one who didn't need the money. Betty has children to raise. Every penny counts. Such luxuries are a thing of the past. And if the books belong to the children, then no, not at any price. That would be too low. She'd be better off scrubbing floors. She would stay up at night, but she would never deprive her relatives of the right to possess such a treasure. Michael's coffee first from behind a fine china cup. Oh, what wonderful coffee! I've never tasted anything like it, laughed the old man. I'm glad you appreciate my specialty recipe, although it's not quite right to call it my own. I learned to make coffee this way from an old Arab named Amin. His coffee shop was in one of the old neighborhoods. Arabs in general appreciate coffee. For them, it's not just a drink, but a whole culture. How interesting is that? Betty exclaimed. Have you traveled a lot? Michael sighed a lot. But Algeria is a salty specialty for us. You see, she worked as a translator at the embassy. She was sent to North Africa right after the Institute. At that time, the Union was actively establishing relations with the Arab states. There weren't many specialists. That's where we met her. And you're a translator too. Betty was surprised. No, not at all, smiled the old man. I was an archaeologist. Betty marveled. Yes, I agree. Not exactly a common profession, replied Michael. For a long time, our group did excavations all over the state. My specialty is Orientalism. I lived in South America for a long time. We found a lot of stuff there. And in the 70s, I received an unusual offer from my university to go to Algeria to excavate in Jammu. Of course, I agreed. It was practically impossible to go abroad at that time. I should not have refused such a chance. And interest, can't go anywhere. So here we are, off to Africa. At first, of course, everything seemed wild, especially the unbearable heat and the absence of the usual amenities. We drove into the mountains. It was very hard to get there, and to be honest, it was scary. People were frightened by the very terrain, and our guide looked like a criminal, Jimmy Hill. This is an ancient Roman city. They started studying it in the early 20th century, so we weren't exactly pioneers. But we had to take into account that Algeria is not a developed country. No roads, no normal stores, and it's in the middle of nowhere. We had to carry all our supplies and equipment on our backs. We had a few mules. I'm still surprised how hardy they are. And Summer, the guide, though he had a creepy appearance, turned out to be reliable and saved us from many dangers. We were several months away from civilization, surrounded by ancient ruins. We saw ghosts and creatures everywhere. But the scariest of all were the nights, or rather the cold that came with them. It's incredible when the temperature rises to +50 during the day and drops below zero at night. In the mountains, of course, it's such a treat in itself, but we were young and brave and obsessed with digging. How did you and your wife meet? Betty asked. Helen. Michael sighed. We first met Helen just as our group was about to head home. The old man drew in more air, as if preparing to dive underwater. After a long pause, he began his story. The excavations of V. Jamal was a success. Krastinsky's group managed to find the remains of thermal baths and well-preserved mosaic floors. They even managed to get a few clay jugs, quite well preserved. Such a find was a rarity, so the archaeologists were already preparing to rest on their laurels of glory. After taking several hundred frames, I scribbled dozens of logs and carefully packed them into the equipment. The group intended to make the return trip for the morning. The last night began as usual. First, it got sharply colder. The guys built fires, cooked dinner, and sat down to tell stories. Life stories quickly slipped away. Then the interpreter Liam started pestering, said to tell them something interesting about this place, something he had encountered himself. The guy did not agree for a long time, but after persistent persuasion and a couple of shots of vodka, his tongue was loosened. I had just started taking scientists to the ruins. The man began in French. Liam translated instantly, but the mixture of languages and the glow of the campfire made everyone uncomfortable. My first group were 4 young Frenchmen. It was just the end of the War of Independence. The atmosphere here was, I can't say the most favorable, but I liked that these young people were free of prejudice and didn't hold their noses high. There was a photographer among them. I think his name was Jean, but I could be wrong. We got there. It was early September. It wasn't too hot during the day, so it was easy going. At the place the guys set up camp, and I went to debunk. They say, what disturb here quickly, so it was decided to start the work in the morning. We also sat as now at the fire and were already preparing to disperse to the tents. Suddenly, one of the guys noticed that Jim was not there. When the photographer left, no one noticed. At first, we thought he had gone to sleep in his tent. Ours didn't turn out to have one. We walked around, calling for him, trying to find him with flashlights. We didn't get any results. The guy was gone without a trace. Not that it's hard to get lost here, but you run the risk of falling into the mountains and getting shot. Sleep was out of the question. Every minute counted. We split into pairs and continued our search. Francois and I went into the mountains, and the other 2 guys went to survey the ruins. When dawn broke, my partner and I returned to camp. As we were coming towards us, a hatchling ran away. One of the ones that had gone to the ruins. The guy was waving his arms and yelling at us to hurry up. We ran after him toward the amphitheater. There on the steps sat Eugen. His head was as white as chalk, though only yesterday he had been a searing brunette. He was frantically clutching his camera and muttering to himself. Only one word, no. It seemed as if the guy couldn't see anyone or anything around him. His pupils were severely dilated, his lips were quivering. He didn't respond to our words. We got him to the camp, gave him tea, and put him to bed. In the morning, he seemed to regain consciousness, but he remembered nothing at all. Perhaps he had managed to take some pictures, but I was never to know. As soon as the guys left, I never heard from them again. There was silence around the fire. The silence was broken by Semyon. Of the whole group, he was the only one who believed in the existence of otherworldly forces. You know, last night I went out of the tent to go to bed, and just in the area of the amphitheater I observed a glow. It seemed to me that the moon was setting there, though it was cloudy. Maybe there really are ghosts there. That's a bit of a mouthful. What kind of ghosts are there? The guys started talking, interrupting each other. Yeah, Michael Ferguson muttered skeptically, to the leader of the group. Such stories had always seemed like complete nonsense. He wasn't going to believe them, but he couldn't sleep well after what he'd heard. When all the boys had gone to their tents, Michael studied for a long time, to wonder what the Frenchman could have seen in the ruins that at once sat suddenly. His reasoning was interrupted by a crackle from the street. The boy poked his head out of the tent, but it was empty. Only the embers of the fire were slowly going out. He was about to climb back in. The crackling sound was repeated. The sound was loud and distinct. Wrong from the direction of the ruins. But no way, Michael muttered, getting out of the tent, whatever it was. It's not coming from the other side of the world. He didn't want to wake anyone, and, armed with a powerful flashlight and a strong stick, set off in the direction of the amphitheater. Michael froze in the center of the structure, not understanding how a person could be here. The logical explanation was that it was someone from the camp. But the figure was dressed in something light-colored, covering almost his entire body. Michael gripped the stick tighter and pointed the beam of light at the man below. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The archaeologist shouted. The figure didn't move. Michael stooped down a couple steps, palms down, sweating. It was scary. Had the guys decided to play a trick on him, knowing how he felt about all sorts of mysticism? "Vatic," shouted he. "If they decided to scare me, it will not work. I'll come down and beat you with this stick." Michael confidently ran down the stairs and approached the figure who had swung the stick. But suddenly the figure rose sharply and turned around. The lantern illuminated a woman's face stained with blood. Michael stepped back. She was paralyzed with fear. The woman stared at him silently. "Who are you?" Barely able to move her tongue, Michael muttered. "Do you need help?" "We have a first aid kit. I'll get it for you. Just don't go anywhere. You understand me. I'll be back." He was about to leave when suddenly the woman grabbed his arm and addressed him in clear American. "You're not a hallucination. You're real. You're here alone." I had given up hope for help. You see, our motorcade was attacked. We were all on our way. But on the way, we walked into a trap. Some men pulled us out of our cars, started pushing us around, trying to get us into their truck. I managed to get away. You can see it's getting dark fast. I know that the city is not that far away, but I am not oriented at all on the Brala. I decided to wait out the night in these ruins, but it's very cold. If not for you, I think, before morning, I would just freeze to death. Only now Michael noticed that the stranger's silk business suit was quite dirty and torn in some places. And what he took for a blanket was a coffee Arabic headscarf. "Jesus, let's get back to camp, you can go," Michael inquired, taking the woman under his arm. "I think so," she replied. "Only the heel seems to be broken." Michael helped his companion to the camp, started a fire, and sat her down on a folding bench. From the tent he retrieved 2 blankets and a first aid kit. Treating the wound on the stranger's face, the guy saw that she was still quite young, no more than 25 years old by the look of it. "What is your name?" the archaeologist asked. "My name is Michael. I'm a Soviet archaeologist, by the will of fate from the party thrown into this wilderness." "And me, Helen," the girl answered and even tried to smile. It was obvious that she was still scared. "Helen, I work at the embassy as an interpreter. We went from Algeria, all on a diplomatic mission to the local university. But like I said, we were attacked on the way. God, what's going to happen to Andrew and the others? I'm the only one who escaped." The girl seemed pretty worried. Michael was also quite alarmed that bandits might be lurking nearby. Of course, they had a few guns in the camp, but they were hardly a good defense. There's no point in worrying about that now, the archaeologist hastened to reassure them. There's nothing you can do anyway. Tomorrow we will go down to the city, and there we will think what to do in this situation. Right now you should be glad that you were not captured. You didn't die in the mountains with those bandits. Liam's head appeared from the tent. Loud voices woke him up. The others also seemed to wake up. In a minute the whole group was already sitting near the fire. They were surprised to see a woman in the camp, and a very beautiful one at that. Nobody fell asleep till morning. At first everyone listened to the story of the appearance of a stranger in the camp, and the remaining few hours were on duty. In the morning, the archaeologists loaded the show on mules and went to the city. Helen was seated on one of the perpetual animals, and Michael walked beside her, ready to support her at any moment. You know, if Seth had not told us that terrible story at night, Michael began suddenly, I would have slept soundly. I'm afraid to imagine what would have happened to you then. What's the story? Helen asked. Is it about ghosts in Roman ruins? That's exactly what the boy laughed. I don't believe it, of course. But somewhere inside there is still hope that after death something remains. And I believe that we are not gone forever, the girl said sadly. In the gendarmerie. Helen long explained the mustache to this man in the night to mirror-shined shoes and white gloves. What had happened yesterday? The officer had called somewhere several times, making the girl languish in suspense. Michael never left her side. The guys had gone to a hotel to sleep it off, and he realized that Helen could not be left alone. After a couple of hours spent at the station, they managed to find out that the diplomatic motorcade had been attacked by a group of radical opponents of the ruling party regime. Helen got through to the embassy and learned that the negotiations had been successful and that her colleagues would soon be safe. At the other end of the wire, they were very happy to hear that the girl was fine and offered to send a car to pick her up, but Helen refused, preferring to get to the capital by train. Michael was very happy about this option. It meant that for some time, he would be able to continue acquaintance with this amazing girl. After all, his group also had to take the train to get to the international airport. In the capital, Alina escorted Michael to the flight. Before landing, they exchanged addresses and phone numbers, and a year later the girl returned to her homeland. By that time, there were real feelings between the young people. And Michael, in order to please his beloved, even began to learn French. Helen was transferred to the consulate. She sometimes had to go to North Africa, but most of the time she spent in the country of the Soviets. Michael tried to peep so that his expeditions coincided in time with his girlfriend's business trips. So it turned out to spend more time together. 2 years later, the lovers got married. Michael did not dote in his girlfriend. Girl shared all his hobbies, infected love for his own. Therefore, the newlyweds always had something to talk about. Hot arguments caused a discussion of literature. Helen passionately collected books. And if Michael favored history and architecture, she grabbed every volume of poetry she could find. On their honeymoon, they managed to go to France. Not just anywhere, but France. Not everyone could afford the Eiffel Tower. But Helen worked at a foreign consulate. She was offered to accompany a high-ranking official at an international forum. The event was to last 3 days, and Helen could stay in a foreign country for another week. And to her great joy, she was allowed to take one relative with her. While his wife attended social receptions, Michael wandered around Paris, took lots of pictures, and practiced his conversational French. A simple Soviet guy was fascinated by this majestic city. Architectural delights amazed his imagination, and the people captivated him with their hospitality. When Lena's official events were over, the couple could finally enjoy all this splendor together. The young wife dragged Michael to flea markets, museums, and cozy coffee shops. At night, they took long walks along the waterfront and dreamed of the future, enjoying the present. A year later, the couple had a son, Alex. Helen was over the moon with happiness. She inherited from her grandfather a huge apartment in the center, where the couple immediately moved. Michael was swamped with work. He was sent to Voronezh, near which were large-scale excavations of ancient sites. For 5 years, he was at home maximum 2 months a year. Helen almost completely took over the upbringing of her son. But even such long absences could not spoil the relationship between the spouses. On those rare days when Michael was home, he tried to make up for the entire period of his absence. Helen and little Alex were marveling. Daddy had so much energy and ideas of what they could do together. He organized large-scale excursions around the city, took them out to the countryside, arranged some fantastic costume productions at home, and still as heatedly argued with his wife about literary preferences. Finally, his voluntary exile ended, and Michael sighed peacefully, except that it became turbulent outside the window. Perestroika was looming in the country, which some awaited with trepidation, others with horror. By 1985, Michael, who successfully defended his doctorate, was already in charge of his own archaeological unit at the university in the fields, traveled rarely swamped with paperwork. By then, the man had not yet turned 40, so he was greatly frustrated by the lack of practical research. Helen continued to work at the consulate to which she had returned after her maternity leave. She didn't even have to worry about a position. There were only a handful of specialists like her, and thanks to her natural charm, she was able to solve. Even brewing conflicts between delegations, Alex already went to the 3rd grade. Unlike his parents, the boy had an unusual attraction to Spanish. Helen did everything possible to give him to one of the most prestigious language schools. By the standards of society, their family was considered exemplary, intelligent, educated, beautiful. The neighbors were especially envious of the fact that the spouses never quarreled in their heads, simply did not coexist. How can one quarrel while living soul to soul? But the spouses paid absolutely no attention to what was going on around them. Michael lost his job. The couple was lucky. Helen was offered a long-term business trip, this time to Canada. The woman accepted without hesitation, realizing what could happen in her native country in the coming years. The most painfully perceived the move was Alex. By that time, he was going through a difficult period of adolescent maximalism. Especially he was in love with his classmate and almost ran away on the eve of the flight. But Michael had a serious talk with his son, convincing him of the need for a temporary move. He quickly adapted to school and made new friends. Michael managed to get a job as a consultant at the archaeology department of the University of Montreal. The couple returned home after a couple of years. Alex stayed in the West, by then enrolled in college. For some reason, Helen was sure her son would never come home. As it turned out, she was right. Alex finished college in Canada, then got a job. He married well and only occasionally came to visit his parents. The couple returned to their luxurious apartment, which had been rented for the past few years by a German diplomat. Helen was delighted when she discovered that her favorite books were literally being dusted off. Husband and wife life flowed back into a familiar pattern. Michael found an interesting niche for himself, consulting and organizing private archaeological expeditions, demand for which grew dramatically by 2000. At home, he only had time to wonder where his wife. By that time already, with the ruling 50 years old so much energy, the woman left the civil service, engaged in tutoring. She liked to teach students French. Young people listened with interest to her stories about her amazing travels in French-speaking countries. And then a terrible thing happened. Helen had a stroke and the right side of her body was completely paralyzed. It was September 6, 2002. Michael was away at the time. He learned about the incident on the phone and immediately dropped all the cases to return to his beloved wife. After a long period of rehabilitation, the mobility of her knees never returned. The disease has severely distorted her speech. All that mattered to Michael was that his wife was alive. But it seemed to Helen that such an existence could not be called life. Michael treated her like a child. Did he only irritate his wife more? At some point, she became very withdrawn, refused to accept his help, so they had to hire a nurse. In the rare moments when Helen's mood improved, he would go into her room and read Arabic tales to her for long periods of time. The woman cried. Michael was confused. He realized that he was completely helpless in the situation. He even tried to go to a psychologist to establish a relationship with his wife. But everything was to no avail. Helen did not want to be a burden, so gradually faded away. This went on for a long 10 years. And then one morning on September 6, 2012, Michael, as usual, went into the bedroom of his wife to wish her a good morning, but was horrified to find her dead. Helen had drifted off to sleep. Her face was calm and even somehow happy. After learning of his mother's death, Alex returned. The funeral was lavish. All her former colleagues and numerous friends came to say goodbye to Helen. Michael, however, the death of his beloved was undermined. The man withdrew into himself. He stopped all contact with society. He realized with horror that together with Helen went that part of him, which made him enjoy every day. His son begged the old man to leave with him, but for Michael such a thing was unacceptable. He became fond of color retardation, began to grow in his indoor greenhouse favorite flowers of his late wife Lavender, and every year carried fragrant bouquets to her grave. Finishing the story, the old man sighed heavily. Betty could see that the memory was causing him unbearable pain. It's been 10 years since she's been gone, but I hope every time I hear her voice again. I know what it's like, Betty replied. My story, although not as romantic, my world literally turned upside down when my husband left. For 4 years now, I've been trying to cope with the loss, but I still can't get used to the fact that he's gone. Betty turned to her. Michael, thank you for listening to the old man's story. You're the first person I've been able to talk to so easily in 10 years. And you know, I'm relieved. Here you go. Michael, do you know if this date, September 6th, is fateful? Betty said thoughtfully. Did you meet Helen on this day? She got sick and died. Same date. My husband died on September 6th, and that's when you and I met. Don't you think that's strange? I don't know, my dear, the old man replied. I don't believe in mysticism, but you can't help thinking. Maybe there really is some kind of correlation. You know, Michael suddenly suggested to Betty that you come and visit us on Sunday. It's my son's birthday. I'd really like you to meet the kids. Betty felt sorry for the lonely old man, trapped in this huge apartment alone with his alien memories of his wife. She liked him a lot, so she thought it appropriate to invite him to a family reunion. I don't know, I'm not sure, Michael replied. Am I disturbing you in your haste to change his mind, Betty? Of course not. You are such an interesting person. I think both you and my children would enjoy getting to know each other. And you and I have a lot to talk about. Honestly, I can't bear to see you suffer. Please come. All right, laughed the old man. I will. From then on, Michael became a frequent visitor to the Johnsons' apartment. The children immediately took a liking to the elegant and talkative grandfather, who had stories for every occasion. They listened for hours about his expeditions, travels to other countries. Often Michael invited them to his house. Katya was captivated by Krasinski's library. Together with Lisa, they read French fairy tales, looking at old engravings depicting the stories of Grandpa, and otherwise they did not call Michael. Spoiled the children with sweets. Showed them outlandish things, pickles he had brought back from foreign trips. Betty was happy to have such a friend in the family. They chatted constantly with Michael, sitting over coffee, discussing everything that could come to mind. As a conversationalist, the old man was unrivaled. He literally knew everything about everything. Little by little, Betty was getting rid of the heavy weight of the past. One weekend, Michael came to visit and immediately pulled Betty aside. Betty, he began. We've been talking for a long time now, and I'm amazed at how much in life I can see how hard you have to raise these wonderful children. Tell me honestly, are you happy with your life? I don't understand you, Michael. Betty replied, embarrassed. Of course I'm content. I have wonderful children, a roof over my head, and now I have a friend like that. Can I complain? That's a good answer. Betty, smiled the old man. But that's not what I mean. Let me get this straight. Do you have enough to live on? Betty opened her mouth, not knowing what to say. They hadn't discussed material matters. Yes, Michael knew she was a manager at a small firm. She never disclosed her salary, but it was easy to guess that it was barely enough money to support such a large family. The apartment was in treacherous need of repair. The car was literally screaming for an emergency. But did it really matter? Betty seriously continued, Michael, you don't say anything. But I'm not stupid. I can see you're having a hard time. And frankly speaking, it's a pity to see such a talented and versatile person wasting away on an unpromising job. So I'd like to make a suggestion. I talked to some of my old buddies. Tell me, would you like to work in a specialty field? You're surprised, Betty. What do you mean? A specialty? A translator? Betty, come on, there's a big company looking for a French translator. It's a prestigious job. It's a representative office of a famous French pharmaceutical company. Believe me, you'll be hired. I've already forgotten the language. Betty mumbled embarrassedly, and talked nonsense. Michael hastened to reassure her. You speak perfectly well, you don't even have an accent. I know what I'm talking about. If you agree, come to the interview tomorrow. It's more of a formality. But you have to come and get to know each other. You can start working right away. Michael, Betty couldn't believe what she was hearing was true. If you're serious, of course I agree. What time tomorrow? Wait a minute. What's Betty? Tomorrow is September 6th. Betty liked her new job very much. She constantly had to communicate with interesting people and regularly flew to France to accompany her boss. She had been in her position for 2.5 years. During this time, she managed to organize her life. Her children were transferred to a prestigious school. The eternal material problems fell away as if by themselves. Even her personal life had moved on. Betty had finally let William go, and one of her co-workers had a clear sympathy for her, which, to Betty's surprise, turned out to be mutual on her part. One day her phone rang in the middle of the night through a dream. She did not immediately understand the meaning of what she heard. A familiar voice announced that Michael Ferguson had passed away today. The old man had gone quietly in his sleep. Her heart stopped. Betty wept. Over the past few years, this elderly man had managed to become a true friend to her, even more of a family man. But his passing had not caused hysteria. She was glad that at last the man would meet his beloved somewhere in heaven, whom he had stubbornly refused to believe in with his mind, but recognized with his heart. Betty helped with the funeral arrangements. Rummaging through the apartment, she found a letter addressed to her, which Michael had apparently written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she unsealed the envelope. Betty took out a neatly written piece of paper. Dear Betty, I didn't want to upset you prematurely, but I feel that I don't have much time left. I'm glad that at the end of my days, life has come back to life. And you and your children. It's a miracle. I tried to do my best to help you deal with whatever was keeping you from breathing a full breath. I want everything to work out for you from now on, so that nothing prevents you from developing and loving life. So please accept my humble gift for Kate, Herb, and Lisa, because I know that for yourselves you will refuse. With sincere respect and love, Michael. Betty was rubbing her hands over the sheet, not understanding what Michael meant. She was both happy and sad to receive such a message from him after he had left. Soon Betty forgot about the letter and plunged headlong into the abyss of everyday life. What a surprise it was when 6 months later she received a call from a notary and was invited to attend the reading of Krestinsky Michael's will. At the appointed hour on September 6, the woman entered the office, where she was informed that the last will of the deceased was to bequeath his apartment to Kate, Herb, and Lisa, and the library of their mother Betty.